welcome to Good Grief, the podcast dedicated to demystifying and destigmatizing grief with compassion and humor. I'm Nikki. I'm an end-of-life doula and a grief coach in Columbus, Ohio. And today I have another special guest episode today. I sat down and had an amazing conversation with my new dear friend, Becky Mollenkamp. Becky is a feminist coach for small business owners who are ready to make the big leap into business, but also want to check out of that hustle culture. Becky is such an amazing human. She is one of the brains behind the podcast collective that I'm a member of now that I've mentioned, the Feminist Podcasters group. So thank you. She has done all the work setting this up. I feel terrible. Every time I join something and everybody else has done all the work, I feel really bad about it. That's just who I am as a person. But she's done so much work to get this collective up and going, and what a great person. And she offered to tell her story of grief and loss on my podcast, and I'm so grateful for that for a lot of reasons. Mostly, I love having people on the show. I love people telling their stories, but it was almost like a breath of fresh air to hear a story so similar to my own, which is why I have this podcast and why I do all these interviews and meet all these people with these different stories of grief and loss, because I'm hoping somebody else out there has this moment like I had when I was chatting with Becky and just hearing myself and her story. But just hearing, something, I'm not going to spoil it. You'll hear her and her story, and you'll probably go, God, this sounds a lot like Nikki. Well, we had similar losses, but at the same time, like I'm always saying, no two griefs are the same, no two losses are the same. So we had a great conversation, though. I will link all her stuff in the show notes. You'll see it. You'll get to hear from her. But before we dive into our conversation, please head on over to patreon.com/NikkiTheDeathDoula. And for as little as $1 a month, you can support me and all that I do. And all the money that I receive from my Patreon goes directly to a fund so that I can provide pro bono work to those who cannot afford my services. I mention that every time. I do have a client I work with off and on who cannot afford my services, and I'm able to help them because of all my wonderful patrons out there. So as always, I'm not using that money to buy bourbon, I promise. I use other money to buy bourbon. Anyway, so patreon.com/NikkiTheDeathDoula. And before we dive in, also, just a couple quick trigger warnings. We do talk about addiction in this episode, and there is language. There will be unbeeped curse words in this episode. So maybe don't bring the little ones into this one. This is probably a more adult subject matter anyway, but like I said, addiction will be mentioned and issues with addiction and overdose, as well as some harsh language. So keep that in mind if that is not your cup of tea. But without further ado, you've heard enough from me. Let's get into this week's episode, my interview with Becky Mollenkamp. There we go. All right. Hey, everybody. Welcome back. Thank you so much for tuning in this week. I have another awesome guest episode. And caveat, I probably mentioned this in the intro. I am sick right now, so I sound terrible, but that's okay. We're going to soldier on. So I would like to introduce my dear friend, Becky Mollenkamp, I'm going to let her introduce herself and tell us a little bit about why you're here today, Becky.
Hi, I'm Becky. I'm an accountability coach, and I work with feminist founders growing their businesses. And I'm not here to talk about my business at all. I'm here to talk about death. Fun. But I know you like to keep it light. So I lost my brother in 2010. So how long has that been? Once you get past the 10-year mark, you start to, it gets a little, it's so funny, interesting that when it first happens, you think you will never, like, it just feels like there's never any chance I won't know how many years it's been or whatever, right? Mm-hmm. And how time changes things, where it's like, how many years has that been now? Yeah. So in 2010, 14 years, it should be easy since it's a 10, but 14 years ago, July 4th to be exact, which I don't know, but we are actually coming up on the exactly 14 years.
Yeah, we are.
And it was on a holiday, which for people who've lost somebody on a holiday, I mean, you know what? It doesn't matter. It doesn't matter what day it is. But one thing that changes a little is when the rest of the world seems to be celebrating and you're like, wait a minute, this is the shittiest day of the year. Can I cuss?
Yes, you can cuss. It's
Okay.
fine.
And you can't, and you think like, why is everyone else so joyous? And so that does create like an extra layer, I think, to this, even though it wouldn't matter what day it is, that day is going to be hard for you. But yeah, I lost my brother in 2010. He died of a heroin overdose. He was an addict. And so that was, I mean, I don't know. We could talk about whatever you want about his death, but I do think one thing I find interesting is that I don't think we talk about sibling loss nearly enough, and specifically even adult sibling loss, although I think child sibling loss is a whole other journey, I am sure.
Yep.
But adult sibling loss is an interesting thing that I don't think gets talked about because rightfully so, the attention shifts to the parents, even if they are elderly parents, adult parents, because no parent should lose their child, right? Like that's just
Right.
not the order of things that are supposed to happen. But what often happens then is so much of the weight and the burden and the responsibility of navigating the logistics of a death, the post-death issues
Hmm.
falls on the sibling,
Yep.
who then their grief gets paused or devalued in a way. And so I just think it's very interesting because I feel like I wasn't prepared for that. And I don't think we talk about it nearly enough.
Yeah.
So anyway, we can talk about that. We can talk about anything you'd like.
Yeah. Well, and it's interesting because I'm listening to you talk and you're telling my exact story with my brother's death. Like, and we lost him in 2015, so we're coming up on the 10-year mark now. But I was just in a recent episode, I was talking about this. I've done episodes on sibling loss before, but I went through a very similar situation when my brother died that I was like, all right, because he had children. He had two small children and obviously my parents. And I was like, it never occurred to me to grieve because I was like, I need to be here for my parents. I need to be here for his kids. And I need to like be the glue that is keeping all this shit together. And I never, ever even thought about grieving his loss until like years later when it caught up to me and I had a complete like mental breakdown. Like,
Hey, we are twins. I
yeah,
had a similar, I avoided it like the plague for about 2 years
yeah.
until it caught up to me. And it always does. That's the funny thing about grief is
Hmm.
it may be a slow runner, but it will catch you
It
eventually.
will. And
Yeah.
he
And
and I
my
had a complicated relationship. We did not get along real well. So, yeah,
Nikki,
I know.
we obviously had a complicated relationship because my brother was an addict, and that
Right.
creates all kinds of issues and
Yeah.
family dynamics. And my brother also had children, and he was not with the mother of the child,
Yeah.
and that created. He actually had another that was adopted because addict, and that child. That adds a whole other complication, and that
Oh,
was a separate situation. But the one that was actually close to him that wasn't adopted out, that was added a whole other layer of challenges with that mom and everything that kind of happened after and horrible dynamics. And for my mom losing her granddaughter, and just there was so much, like there were so many layers of stuff. And I think the hardest part for me, and this may relate, you may relate to it, was because of all of that complication. I think in some ways it felt easier to distance myself a bit in the moment. I mean, I had a breakdown when I found out. It
oh
was
yeah.
like my knees were literally buckled under me. Like I had
Yeah.
that
Yeah.
TV movie moment where I fell to
Yeah.
the ground and dropped
Yeah.
the phone and this can't be real, like this whole thing. But once I got through that, I had to drive all the way. So I had moved to another state.
Oh,
So
gee.
I was far away and by design. My brother was challenging. He was a manipulator. I mean, he was a classic addict. He was very manipulative and deeply depressed, and just it was very hard to be around him. And when we were young, we were so close, and I was the older sister, and it was hard because we were really close. Then he, around 12 started to, move into alcohol and then eventually into drugs, and over time it just became very difficult to be in that environment. And because my mother chose to enable, because and now that I'm a mom, I understand it in ways that I
Yeah.
couldn't then.
Yeah.
And I chose tough love. And what I've learned through the process is it doesn't freaking matter what you choose.
I know,
You will
right?
feel guilt afterwards, right?
I
Right.
know, because I went that I had a lot of tough love with my brother too, and I
Yep.
just
And then
uh,
you're left feeling like maybe I shouldn't have. And my mom was left with the same stuff, but on the other side of it, like maybe if I had been tougher. And so
yeah.
that actually gave me some peace because it was like, well, it wouldn't have mattered because I can see we took the exact opposite approach and we both were feeling the same way
Yeah.
afterwards. So I'm like, well, clearly it wouldn't have mattered. Like it didn't matter.
Yeah.
It was just his journey. That was the journey he was going to have. And that's hard, but it's also like, for me, there was some freedom in that. But I had moved away because I was like, I needed to, for my own sanity, sort of start to extricate myself from that situation and say, I can't let you take me down with you, which is a hard thing to do. But also, like, that was part of my process, was like, I can't let this consume me. And so I moved away. And that began this distance, like this emotional distancing that happened. So by the time, when he died, it was crippling and awful. And by the time I drove back home, someone drove me back, it was 6 hour drive. So I got back, to my mom about 8 hours after getting the news. And by then I was feeling pretty numb. Like I had gone to this place of numbness, like of just, okay, now what? Right? What do we do? And it was easy for me to get there because I had done a lot of emotional numbing with his throughout his life of having to be able to
Sure.
function. And so, yeah, when I got there, it was kind of like, okay, what do we do? What do we go through the motions? And I don't know about you, but we told his daughter, who was 9, that by far, out of all of the experience of it, was the most horrible, heartbreaking, difficult. Like, to hear a child scream at the loss of their parent is like, awful. That's the moment that I'll
Yeah.
never be able to unlive. But also, as I now know as a mom, in that moment that my maternal instinct came out, where it was like we all knew we had to get strong then, right? So that, like, even then it wasn't about like, you're doing more of this like pushing down your own stuff to be able to be strong for his daughter, to be able, and then, with my mom was rightfully so
Yeah.
devastated.
Oh,
And
yeah.
so I'm having to, like, how do I show up for her? How do I show up for his daughter? How do I, like, and then it's okay, well, I knew somebody who worked at a funeral home in town, so I got a hold of her, and like I was making the appointments. I was going, I was, telling all this, I know, because you did the same
Yeah.
thing. Yeah. And it was just like, okay, by the end of all of that, after days, and then we had, I mean, there was so much trauma around his daughter because they packed her up and took her. She
Oh,
lived, she was living with my brother, and they took her from the memorial and drove her out and like to basically never see again. So like there was a lot. And we went and saw like my mom's pastor person. We're none of us are real religious, but and this I remember her saying, and if she listens to this, Mom, I love you. We've worked through these things. But I remember her saying in that moment, she's like, now what do I have to live for? Like, no one needs me.
oh,
Because she had gotten so into that role of being
right.
needed by him.
Right.
And in a way, I wasn't needing her. She's right in that. Like, I was living in another state. I was fully, like, I was 35 and doing really well in my life.
Hmm.
I didn't need her in that way, but I still need my mom. Like, we all need our
Oh,
parents,
yeah.
right?
Oh,
Right?
yeah.
Like, I need my mom still. And so to hear that was like, I was sitting there going like, oh, hi. What about
Yeah.
me? You still have a child here. Like, I am
Yeah.
still here and living, and I may not be as dependent, but I
Yeah.
still need you. I still love you. I
Yeah.
still want you in my life. So like I was having all of this stuff. There's just so much going through that process, which I think anyone who's gone through stuff, like, you realize, like, everyone is raw, everyone is lost. People say things they don't mean to say.
Yeah.
People don't know how to navigate. Like, it's awful.
Hmm.
But so all of that, like, there was just all these things that felt like they just kept coming at me that were sort of suppressing and suppressing and suppressing, where I just kept feeling like, okay, I don't feel permission or safety or ability to like grieve here. So
Yeah.
by the time I returned, and then my mom came back with me to where I was living, 6 hours away, to stay with me for another week or two after, which was good. She needed that. And so again, that extended out this time of like, okay, I'm caring for her, taking care of her. And by the time she was gone, I was back on my own. I was going through a divorce at the exact same time. So my ex and I were already in a bad, like, we were separated when he died, which is a weird, like, that created all kinds of weird issues too, like, to be in this really, and my best friend and I at the time, she had kind of chosen my ex through this divorce process. Well,
Oh.
so then I was alone up there when I got the news, and I didn't know where to go. So I went to her immediately. She wasn't home. I ended up going to her mom's house because
Oh.
I was like, I can't be alone right now. I don't know what to do. I was
Yeah.
like lost. And they took care of me. She's the one who drove me home, but things were fractured. So like I was just feeling so alone in that moment anyway, because I was living hours away from my family. I was going through this divorce. My best friend and I were having this falling out. Like everything was just kind of a disaster. So my mom left, and now here I am. And I'm like, okay, I probably should have in that moment chosen just say, I'm just going to go into grief. But honestly, it felt way unsafe to do that because I was feeling sort of alone and didn't have
Sure.
anyone that I felt like I could really rely on to do that. And so I just spent the next 2 years avoiding. I was out probably from the outside looked like I was having a great time, lots of fun because I was spending a lot of time drunk. And I'm not, my brother was the addict. I'm not an alcoholic. I'm not an addict. I'm not a big drinker. Like now I don't even really drink ever. I'm someone who can very much drink socially. I don't have that addiction thing. Like I
Yeah.
tried to get addicted to cigarettes when I was in college and couldn't, like, because I just thought it was disgusting. Like I'm just
That's funny.
not that kind of addictive person. But for 2 years, I was drunk almost every night, not like me. And I was sleeping around. I was going out until 2 in the morning and then going to work at 6 in the morning. I was not sleeping. I lost a lot of weight.
Mhm.
And because of the world we live in, I then became more desirable, right? And I was newly single. I had been with my ex from like basically college. Like we met when I was in high school. So from college until then, I had never had that wild time. So like at 35 to 37, I went through this like college years, basically. I had 2 years of my college years at that time in my life. And it was wild. There's parts of it that were fun. But the truth is, most of it was me just being really depressed and not facing that. Like,
Yeah.
I would tell people I wasn't depressed. I would laugh about, I would make jokes about not having a brother or whatever. But
Yeah.
like, I was deeply depressed and couldn't see it. And I think people who didn't know me well would probably say I wasn't depressed. People who knew me well knew I was depressed and not facing it.
Mhm.
And finally, after it was just over 2 years later, I had a falling out with a friend because I
Okay.
was a horrible bitch to her. It was my fault. Like I was going through all this stuff. I was really not nice to her. And that was the thing that finally woke me up and I was like, what am I doing? Like I finally had that moment. Like it was going to come eventually where I was like, what am I doing? Who am I? What is this? This is not me. This isn't enjoyable. It feels really empty and I don't like this. And so I had to eat some humble pie over the next like 3 months. I stopped drinking so much. I sort of slowed down my life and started thinking like, what do I want to do here? And I finally was like, I need to grieve and I don't want to do it, but I need to grieve.
Yeah.
And so at 37, I moved back home with mom,
Oh my gosh.
my humble pie. But I was like, listen, also there's a great amount of privilege in being able to do that. And I
Oh,
fully
sure.
honor that that was a lot of privilege that I was able to move back to my mom's house. And honestly, I got there and I realized like it was the best thing for both of us. And I'm so glad I did it because 2 years later, I mean, she was still full in grief mode and was not, she was depressed. She was depressed too. And
Sure.
so I moved back home. And over the next 6 months, both of us, I think, really went through the coming out of the grief. For me, it was like fully grieving. And I honestly think her having me to take care of, going back to that, I need to care for somebody, sort of helped her too of coming out of her grief and being able to like feel like she had that purpose again, right? She had me again. Cause I mean, I was gone. And I feel bad about that. Like for 2 years following my brother's death, we barely saw each other because I was
Yeah.
living hours away and she was working full time still then. She wasn't retired yet. So that process for me, that 6 months was like everything. And I was a mess. I cried every day. I was running then a lot. So I was pounding out my grief. Like I would go run miles and miles every day and just
Mhm.
like listen to sad music and do a lot of journaling. And I was thinking I might write a book about grief at that point about like sibling loss. So I was doing a lot of writing and blogging and stuff. And the blogging was great because then I was getting feedback from people saying, oh my God, I lost my brother, I lost my sibling, and this
Yeah.
is so hard, and people don't talk about it and whatever. So all of that process slowly but surely after about 6 months, it was like 6 months of intense grief. So I sort of took it all at once instead of over time. And by the end of that, I was feeling like I changed my entire life. I was like, I don't want to do anything. I don't want my life to look anything like it's looked. I want it to
Yeah.
fully change because
Yeah.
it helped me see that like life is too short. And so from there, I changed everything. And I'm, this is the part that I think people who haven't lost someone can't understand. I'm so grateful for my brother's death.
Hmm.
Would I take him back any day? Of course.
Yeah.
But I'm also so
Yeah.
grateful for the gifts that it gave me of realizing what I wanted in my
Yeah.
life.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Like,
And we're back.
Um, yeah, I have talked a lot about how my brother's death has moved me to the work I do now as a death doula and a grief coach because I learned so much about grief in the aftermath of not grieving and then grieving without, without planning on it. Because like you, it snuck up on me and I had to go through that process much, much later. Like after everybody else had been through all these, then I was just starting. And it was so confusing and complicated. And at first, I didn't even realize that was going on. I just thought I was really, because I have a history of mental illness and depression, and I just thought I was in a really bad place. And it just got so bad. And finally, like the third therapist I saw was like, "Have you ever processed the grief of your brother's death?" And I was like, "What? Sorry?" And
What's that?
once I know, I'm like, what do you mean?" And, we went through everything together because, I was like, well, you know, I guess not because, I was like, here's what my parents went through. They're like, no, no, no. What have you done for your grief? And then I was like, shit, nothing, not a damn thing. So once I knew what it was and I could start processing it as grief and not just a depressive episode, it helped so much. And I was like, God, how many people are out there grieving something that they don't know they're grieving? Um, so that's where got started into this. It's just
Yeah. I mean, that's what happened for me. Obviously, I'm not a grief doula,
right.
but or death doula. But what I did realize was I didn't want it to take your whole life feeling like it's been uprooted for a woman to say, I can live a life I want to live. Right. Because I had been the good girl, which was very much grounded in my brother's stuff too. Right. Because I had to be the one who was responsible, who took care of things. I helped take care of him and making sure my mom, who was depressed, which I now understand, again, becoming a mom really changes your understanding of your own parent. Because I realized how hard my brother was and how challenging that was for her. So she spent a lot of time depressed. So I was like a perfect Pisces who was creating this balance and keeping the peace between them and helping both of them. And so like I spent my whole life being responsible and the good one. And all of that looked like, what do I need to do to make sure everyone else is okay? And
Yeah.
so I ended up being a good girl and doing all the things I should and making sure I got good grades because I was like, I can't add anything more to my mom's plate. Like, that's
Yeah.
not okay. And so I was very much the good girl. And I went through the motions in life of like, what am I supposed to do? Well, I'm supposed to get married and I'm supposed to get a good job and I'm supposed to go to college and all the things, right? So I did all the things I was supposed to. Thankfully, I didn't have kids then.
Yeah.
That was one should I didn't do, which I'm glad because I do now, but that's in my second marriage and it's the right place to be doing that. But I had done all of these shoulds and was 35 when my brother died and then got hit with a ton of bricks of like, this is not a life I want. Like I had this wonderful on paper life, but not a wonderful I want life. And actually, I was already having that realization before my brother died. So about
Mhm.
6 months or so before he died is when I started like having to confront, I'm not happy, but I wasn't
Right.
able to say it out loud. And I started acting out and like challenge, like, so we were separated, my ex and I, but I was still like, sort of like, well, maybe we can make this work or whatever. And it was my brother's death that really helped me say, like, life is too short to keep
Yeah. Yeah.
doing shoulds and to feel this way. And so that whole process, when I came out on the other side of it, my version of your story is I knew I wanted to help other women not have to like I wanted to help other good girls be able to have a life that they really wanted without having to first go through all the shit that I had to go through to get there. Like
Yeah.
I wanted them to be able to have that awakening and that realization and that process without having to like be in grief to
Yes.
get there. And
Yes.
so yeah, it was the same, but it's the same thing for me as like that. It changed everything. So from there, it was like eventually that 6 months of my grieving looked a lot of my grief work was actually internal work of what do I want for my life?
Yeah.
What do I want this? What do I had never asked myself that. What do I want? What do I
Yeah.
want my life to be? I mean,
Yeah.
I was like, wow, I'm 37 and I haven't even explored what do I want. And
Yeah.
so I think I had part of it was, and this again, for people who don't go through it, I don't think but like when you have someone who's an addict, like there it was the first time that I was like being able to ask what do I want, and that was part of the grief because I never had felt I had that permission or space, and
Yeah.
without him there it suddenly felt like okay, I can now explore, like I have this freedom in my life that I haven't had up until now because that stressor, again, I love my brother and
Yeah.
I would have him back any moment, but he was also a giant stressor in all
Yeah.
of our lives. Having an addict in your life is a deeply stressful thing and
Mhm.
one who just can't seem to get clean. And so without that giant stressor in our lives, it was like there was suddenly all of this space for me to say, I can actually ask what I want here and I can explore
Yeah.
that. And I don't have to feel worried about like what that's going to do if it's not the thing I was supposed to do and if it upsets my mom or, whatever. And
Yeah.
so it was really wonderful in that way.
Yeah.
But it took time to be able to get like there's the grief inside of that of like all the guilt that comes up of these things. Like I'm so far on the other side of it now at 14 years that I can say this and I don't feel all of that guilt. But imagine, when you're just facing the grief for the
Oh,
first time,
yeah.
there's a lot of guilt and being like, oh my God, I feel free to explore these things, or
I know.
the stressor is gone. And like that's hard. So that was the stuff I had to confront in that time too. It's
Yeah.
like those feelings of like the relief.
Yeah. And that's
Oh,
something I bring up a lot is as when it comes to situations like yours, where, the person is an addict or in a situation of a caregiver who's caring for somebody who's had a terminal illness for years and their
yeah.
person dies and they feel such a sense of relief. And then they feel shitty about it because they're like, how
Yeah.
dare I feel relieved? That doesn't mean you don't love them or you don't wish they were back. It just means you don't have that thing anymore over your head. And you're not waiting for that phone call of, this person has overdosed or this person, their addiction, or waiting for them to just die of whatever their illness is. You're not, it's like waiting for anything for so long, you just feel like you're holding your breath. And then it
Oh,
happens and you don't have to hold your breath anymore.
yes, Nikki. I mean, for 20 years almost of my brother's life, I mean, I used to tell people my brother's not going to live a very long
Mhm.
life. And then there's that part of you that's like, did I will this into existence or something? But I
Yeah.
don't really believe that because I always thought he wouldn't live much past 30 and he died at 30. And I mean, because it did feel like this inevitable end of a 20-year journey, a nearly 20-year journey of his addiction. And he was depressed. He was always like, even long before that, his brain just wasn't wired right. Like, and that's what I try to remember. And it's because it was not his fault. Like
Right.
there was something very wrong in the way his brain was wired. They
Right.
never really quite got to the right diagnosis with him, I don't think. I think
Mhm.
ultimately they sort of settled on bipolar, but honestly, I don't know if that was it either. And there was many different diagnoses over the years of what might be going on, but there was clearly something wrong and
Yeah.
it wasn't the best way, but it was the only way he could figure out to try and make his brain feel better for him. So like I've dealt with a lot of that and I understand that. But when you spend not I mean honestly almost the full 30 years of his life either trying to protect him, help him. Like, because the first 12 years of his life, 10 years of his life were me just wanting, like, I was this fierce protector of how do I make you feel okay?
Yeah.
Because he was always like, it was always something wrong and he was sensitive and always hurting and sad and all the stuff. And so it's like me just like, how do I make you better? Right. Because I loved
Yeah.
him and I'm like, how do I make you better? I want to make you okay. And then when he started down his path towards addiction, it was like, I always thought the call would come. And it's so weird how you can be bracing for it, like you said, holding your breath for 20 years for the call. And then when it shows up, be fully unprepared.
Oh, yeah.
Right.
Oh,
Like it's
yeah.
wild. I knew that I was going to get that call someday. Like I just always knew it. And when
Yeah.
it showed up, it was like, I couldn't believe it was real.
Yeah. I warn people of that all the time in my work as a death doula. I'm like, whoever your person is has probably had this illness for a while and you've been prepared and they go into hospice, like your whole like existence becomes preparing for this death and I'm walking you through it. You're still not going to be prepared. Like it's
No,
going
you
to
just,
happen and you're still going to be like, what the hell? What, there's no
yeah,
preparing for it. And same with my brother. He had a lot of health issues, and I kept saying, I know he's not going to live that long, probably, but still, the day I got the call, I was just devastated, and I
you're
couldn't believe
numb.
it. And
Yeah.
Yeah, I had the same thing. I'm like, did I make this happen?
I know,
I
right?
remember.
All of the feelings come up, right?
Yeah. And I too kind of collapsed when I got the call, and I was shaking so hard I couldn't get the keys in my hand, and then I had to wait to drive out to my parents because I was like, I'm shaking too hard. I'm crying. There's no preparing. You can
No,
prepare all you want, but you're never ready.
right. And I think because I've also lost no one nearly as close as my brother, but I lost a cousin to a car accident and he was
Ugh.
18. And I remember that call and being like the shock of it because there was no, it wasn't like he was sick. It wasn't like he was an actor. There was no like, he was young and youthful so there was no amount of like thinking it would happen. And I know that people who haven't had both of these experiences may not believe or understand this, but I will tell you the shock is no different.
Yeah.
Like, and it can be hard to believe because you think, but because even with somebody who's old, like your grandparent or something, like
Hmm.
it's just the finality of it is the thing that's so
Yeah.
shocking. And it doesn't matter if you know it's coming. It is
Yeah.
still just like your body goes into this like because your body is having to confront like, no, this is now it's real. It because even when you know it's coming, it's still theoretical
Yeah.
until it's real. And then when it's
Yeah.
real, your body's just like, wait, what?
Yeah.
Like
Yeah.
it's
It
hard. It's really
it
hard.
does. It takes some time to readjust yourself, to this new
Hmm.
reality. Um, so if you if you were to meet somebody today who's has a sibling who is still alive but is facing an addiction, what type of advice will you give to them?
Well, the first thing is the thing we talked about, which is like it is so hard for people to hear, but you have to do what's right for you.
Yeah.
Because and if what's right for you is enabling, like I'm not here to judge that, right? Because I think you have to do what's right for you. Because if you I don't at the end none of it will have mattered. If let's hope that if you have somebody who's still alive and facing addiction, that they can get help that will
Yeah.
work. My brother was actually, he died waiting for a bed, which is hard, right? Because we have very serious problems in this country with mental health
Mhm.
care and with addiction care. There's not enough capacity for people. My brother asked for help and they couldn't get him a bed for 3 days. And in those
Yeah.
3 days, he died. And so I hope for people that your loved one can get help. And listen, I don't know that that bed would have been the bed that would have saved him. He had
Yeah.
been through, it's not like it was the first time,
Yeah.
and anyone who's been through it probably knows for most people it takes more than one time. But so I would hope, first of all, just keep the hope. Keep the hope
Yeah.
that you're and the faith that they can find the help, but also free yourself from the notion that
Mhm.
you are responsible for that in any way.
Yeah.
That anything you do makes the difference
Yeah.
because it ultimately is up to them. And that is really, really hard. It's really, really hard. That's the hardest part of it was like having to confront that it doesn't matter what you do.
Yeah.
They are ultimately in charge of they're responsible for their addiction. They're the ones who have to decide that it's time to get help and
Mhm.
that they're going to do it and that they're going to stick with it. And they may fail. They will probably fail multiple times,
Yeah.
but hopefully eventually they will get the help they need. But the only thing you can do is be there in whatever capacity allows you to
Mhm.
still live your life
Yeah.
because you can't sacrifice your life for their life.
Yeah.
I don't think. But if you do decide that you want to be that person who does, then that's also okay. Like, because at the end, I just like if the end were to come, I think you need to feel good about whatever choices you made while they were there. And as hard as it was, I feel good about the fact that I didn't let my life stop
Yeah.
years.
Yeah.
you know and my mom I think feels good about the fact that she got the time with him that she wanted, not the time she wanted, but she was there for him and
Yeah.
that she did everything she could. And I think each of us felt good about our choices, but also I want you to know you're going to feel shitty about your choice if
Yeah.
ultimately they die. And that's I don't know, for me there's freedom in that, maybe not for everyone,
Yeah.
but yeah, I mean, I think the biggest thing is to free yourself from the notion that it's your responsibility
Yeah.
or that they're like that literally that you have any agency or power inside of that.
Yeah.
You just don't.
Yeah.
Addiction is wholly their issue, which is really, really
Yeah.
hard.
So, and two thoughts on that. One, it's like we talk about this in self-care and, self-image, like you can't control what other people think. It's a very similar, like you can't control their their addiction any more than you can control somebody's cancer, right? You could treat it, but they have to want to treat it. The other thing is I have had at least and I'm just doing this off memory in the top of my head, two people on this podcast so far, maybe three, who have been former addicts and are now sober. And one of them comes to mind. He has a podcast too, Tommy Dussault. So hi, Tommy, if you're still listening. He was near death more than once. He hit rock bottom several times before he finally got, found sobriety. He's been sober for a long time now. And he and the other people I've spoken to who are former addicts have said specifically, there was nothing anybody could have done to save me. I had to be ready to save myself. So thank you for sharing that. And I know you, me, everybody I know who's dealt with an addict in their life. I've lost two or three people in my life to alcohol and or drugs. And I know, like, I have that guilt of maybe if I just love them a little more, said something, like, I know, like, there's nothing I could do unless they were ready.
Yeah. And it's really, really hard. That's really hard to be with because especially when it's someone you love so fiercely, you want to help them so much, but I mean, it's not like there's nothing you can do. You can be there to
Right.
listen.
Absolutely.
You can be there to help them make phone calls to try to find that bed, whatever. Like there are things that you can do, but the thing you can't do is force them in some way to
Yep.
want to get sober.
Yep.
And tough love isn't going to force it. Enabling isn't going to force. There's hard conversations. Like you can do the things, but just know that it's not going to happen until they're ready. And that is so flipping hard. I love what you said too, though, because I had to remember this also because addiction, I think, is a disease. And I actually don't know if the addiction's the disease. I think there is something, generally I have found there is something in people's brain chemistry that's actually the disease that the addiction is trying to treat. And so in the same way that you would not be like, I can't believe you're getting chemo for your cancer. Like can't, I just don't think we should be like, I can't believe you're drinking or you're using drugs for like, of course they are until they can find something that works better. They're trying to find relief. And so if you can also find that place of empathy, I think that goes a long way because I know I didn't have enough of that then. I had a lot of judgment. And I think my judgment was grounded in hurt and sadness and all of that, right? But I think, I would be so different with my brother now because I've done so much of my own work, but I don't think I could be this person without having had lost him, honestly. So like, right, it's the catch-22 of it. But yeah, I don't know, finding some empathy to say like, if the disease you were facing was cancer, I wouldn't be upset that let's forget even chemo. Let's just say I wouldn't even be upset that you were smoking marijuana, right? Like you were smoking pot to try and find some relief from the pain.
Yeah.
Is it the answer? Maybe not, but is it helping you? And I can see that and at least understand it. And then maybe I could say, hey, let's also go get you some chemo or see a doctor, or right.
Yeah.
And so maybe it's the same thing with an addict, but I don't know. I just finding some empathy because it can be very hard if it's not your own journey to find that empathy for them because all you can think is, why are you doing this to yourself?
Yeah.
Stop it.
Yeah.
And to try and remember, no one's choosing it. No one chooses to be putting needles into their body and like sleeping on the streets. And like, I mean, the shit that my brother went through, he ended up with a horrible staph infection because he was using, and like, I mean, he had to have some serious pain and like serious help from that and days and weeks in the hospital. Like chooses that. Right. Yeah. But it can be hard if you're not that person and you love them and you just think like, what are you doing? And it's like, no, it's not choosing that.
I know. It's so hard. It's so easy to look from the outside in and be like, just stop doing drugs.
Right. When you're not a person who has that, because I can't be an addict because I just don't have whatever that is different in their brains. I believe that there's just something different in the brain.
Absolutely. And I'm the same way. Like I definitely have times where I drink probably a little more than I should, but I'm not an alcoholic. I can, I have stopped drinking. I'm like, I'm just not going to drink this week and it's fine. I can function.
I mean, I can't even tell you the last time I've had a drink now, but if I had one tomorrow, I would be fine. And then I could go another 6 months without having a drink, or another year, and I know I can say with 100% certainty, I could go the rest of my life without drinking. It wouldn't do anything to me. It would be fine. Like I could live with that. It's social lubrication and nothing more for me. And so it's hard for me to understand.
It is.
And the older I get, the more I recognize like it is exactly the same as if you had cancer or whatever that leads people to have these brain differences. The other thing I would just say too is like, I've had some of the best bonding experiences I've had around death, besides other people who've lost someone to addiction, are people who've lost someone to suicide. Because
Oh,
addiction and suicide deaths, while different, the thing that's so similar is the stigma attached to those deaths, which
yes.
got to change in this country.
Yes.
And so I don't know, I just want to point that out for some reason. I just feel like I need to call it out because I just feel like there is this bonding thing that can happen often with people who've lost someone to addiction and to someone who's lost someone to suicide.
Yeah.
Because we stigmatize these deaths, and it's so problematic because it leaves the people that love those people. I think there's that same thing of, could I have done more?
Yeah.
What didn't I do? What's wrong with this person, whatever. And we treat the way we treat somebody who's lost someone to addiction or suicide, I have noticed, is very different than when someone's died accidentally in a car accident
Yeah.
or died of cancer. There is a difference in how I feel like you are treated. And that's so problematic. So I guess for people who might listen, who are going through a different kind of death experience and or just listen because they're interested in grief and how to help people with
Yeah.
grief, be mindful of how you're treating people when they've
Yeah.
lost someone because that person was an addict or because that person died by suicide. Because I can tell you in both cases, the person didn't just choose it. The
Right.
person wasn't just like, oh, I'll just it's the same thing. It's that same, like, why can't you just do it different? Like, they're
Yeah.
not just choosing suicide because it's fun. They're not just choosing
Right.
heroin because it's, fun. Like, and we need to bring that same level of empathy we bring to somebody who died of cancer when we're talking to people who've lost someone from these other types of deaths. Because I
Agree.
will say the parents, everyone, but the parents, I think most especially, are racked with guilt.
Yeah.
They
Oh,
are
yeah.
sitting. And then when you add to it by some sort of like, well, he chose that, or too bad he didn't do something different, or whatever. Like, there are some
Mhm.
people will say some of the most hurtful things.
Yeah.
That does not help those people
No. No.
at all.
And I've talked many times on this podcast about things you probably shouldn't say to somebody after they've had a loss. But no, thank you for bringing that up. And I know I hate the stigma, but there are people who have lost somebody to drugs or suicide, and they won't even say it. They'll make something up, or they'll deny it, or it was just X, Y. Like, I don't know, because because the guilt, right?
My
And
mom did that. My
it's,
brother died of a heroin overdose, but because of the heroin overdose, he fell. He was kneeling when when he took his last bump. I don't know. I don't even know how drug terms. When he
I don't
took
know
his last,
either.
the last time he injected heroin into his body, he was kneeling on a bathroom floor that was concrete. And it was too much. So he passed out, obviously, or died,
Yeah.
and fell forward and hit his head on the concrete. And
Oh,
that cracked open his head. And so technically, although we don't know for sure which actually killed him first, but my mom was telling people he died from, like
well,
hitting his head. And I get it. But I was like,
yeah.
why are we doing this? Let's just
That's
be
it.
honest.
Yeah. And
And
I
I
get
think
it
for,
too,
yeah,
but
right. I
it
think
is,
for her grief for a while, she needed
of
that.
course. Of
And I
course.
think now she doesn't say that. She now is much, I know now she doesn't say that, but for
Yeah.
a while, that was the way she had to deal with it. And I get it. But I think part of that is because of that stigma that she
Yeah.
felt that need to say that instead of being able to just tell people the truth and have them treat her the
Yeah.
same way as they would when they hear. Because I know what happens. One is, oh my God, how tragic. I
Yeah.
can't. And one is like, oh gosh, yeah, wow, sorry. Like there's
Yeah.
this of the way people respond to you, and there shouldn't be.
Yeah.
Makes me sad. Makes me mad.
I know. We could go on all day.
Yeah, I know we could.
All right. Well, since we're getting close to the end of the episode, I have a little tradition. The end of every episode, I pull a card from the death deck, but today I'm using the end of life deck. So end of life deck. I'm going to pull one at random, and then I will let you answer it, and then I will answer it. Um. Oh, okay. I like this one. Sometimes they're really hard. This one's not bad. With regard to let me start that again. With regards to notifying others after you die, A, I have an address book or list of important people to contact. B, post away on social media, but wait until my immediate friends and family know. Or C, I'm sure an obituary will suffice, but feel free to handle it however you want.
I mean, I like B. I want to get to the place of A.
Yeah.
And I've had this conversation lately of like, I've had these thoughts of like, shit, if I were to die tomorrow, Like my husband doesn't even know how to get into my computer. He doesn't know my logins to get onto social media to announce it. Like all that stuff. I'm like, I need
Yeah.
to make a thing. And I think there's this thing of it feeling so morbid. And then there is that part of like, there's some weird part of your brain that goes, are you willing this into happening now?
Yeah.
Like,
Nope,
and
you're
I just,
not. Spoiler, you're not.
I know,
You're
but it
not.
still comes up. So I want to get to A. That is my goal. Right now, it's probably C because I would like it to be B, but he couldn't even get into my social media if he wanted.
Yeah.
But I mean, I would like it to be where there's like, it's on the news, there's a press release, it's everywhere, and people are dancing not because they're happy I'm gone, but because they know I lived a good life.
Yay. I like that. I'm definitely A. I have a spreadsheet.
Of course you are. You're a death doula. You better have.
If I
all of
didn't,
your-
I would be a bad. No, I wouldn't be a bad death doula. But no, actually, a friend of mine years ago, she is unmarried. She has an adult daughter who has a lot of health stuff too, and she's like, I am just concerned that if something happens to me, she can't handle it. Will you be like a backup? I was like, absolutely. So she made a Dropbox with all her documents and a spreadsheet of people to call, and she shares that with me, and she goes in and updates it. And I was like, I'm going to do the same thing because, like,
Smart.
how are my clients going to know? You know, like,
Exactly. That's the part I think about. Like friends and family, great. That they're going to find out about it. But yeah, my
right,
business part, I'm like, holy
right.
crap, it's all in this laptop that is protected with my thumbprint. Like, oops,
Yeah.
I better get that figured
Yeah.
out.
Yeah. So I have a plan of action for that. I remind my husband, like, where the stuff is. Here's the list of people you should call that he might not know about. Here are my clients.
And
Like,
look, you haven't willed it into existence. You're still
no,
here. So
see?
that's right. There's my
So
reminder. I know.
planning doesn't make it happen.
I know. And guess what? You're going to get real mad. I don't even have a will. And so I need to get on that too. I know. All right. I know.
Oh.
I know. But still your heart. I know. I need to I need to work
It's
on
okay.
it.
It's okay.
It's one more of those things. I have a kid too, so I really need to do this. I always think wills are for people who have money. And I know that's not true. So I need to get
Yeah.
on that.
Well, if nothing else, just think about if something, God forbid, were to happen to you and your,
That's the
loved ones
kid.
all at
I
once,
know.
like who's going to
Yeah.
take care of the kids?
I know. Well, we've verbally expressed all that, but I also, having gone through what we went through with my niece after my brother's death, I do fully realize that people can
Yeah.
behave differently after
Oh, they will.
the person's gone than they what you have or
They
have
will.
discussed. And so it would be wise to put it in writing. So
All right, Becky, this has been lovely. I'm
thank
going to give
you.
you a minute here. Take the floor. Tell people where they can find you, all about your
Oh,
business and your podcasts and all that good
okay.
stuff.
I will, but also I feel like it's just so different than death that I don't know. But if you're listening and for some reason also run a business and want to do business outside of like capitalist corporate American norms, my podcast is Feminist Founders. I have a newsletter by the same name, and that's also the kind of coaching I do. So you can find me through that. And then also I have a new podcast called Messy Liberation with my friend Taina Brown, where we talk about like everything through a lens of just as a couple of intersectional feminists talking about we'll talk about death too. I don't know, but we've talked about trashy TV all the way to
I
like
love
talking
it.
about divesting from, companies that support genocide. So like we talk about everything.
Yeah, awesome. Thank you, Becky. This has been
Thank
amazing.
you.
Thank you so much for sharing your story. It seems so familiar to me.
I feel like it is very familiar. I'm just a few years farther down the line than you. So soon you won't even remember you'll have to go, wait a minute, how many years has it been?
I know. The other day I thought about it because, speaking of, my brother also died on a holiday. It was it was a day before Memorial Day.
Oh, so you know that like, yeah, everybody else is like, what are you doing for the holiday? And you're like, I'm going to be
Funeral?
crying. I'll be crying. Thank you. Well, even years after you're like, I'll be
Yeah.
sitting there in my bedroom crying. Although
Yeah.
I will tell you that's starting to like, it is amazing how the time helps. It does help. It doesn't make you miss them any less, but it makes it less like, it feels like this like broken bone or something. I've never had a broken bone, so I don't know if this is true, but something that you've had where you're like the scar is there. And so it's healed, but you can still feel the scar. Like it's never
Yeah.
going away. That scar's
Oh,
still
yeah.
there, but that it's no longer this gaping wound that's just profusely bleeding, right? Or it's not scabbed over where it's painful to the touch. It's like,
Yeah.
oh yeah, that's still there,
It's
but
still there.
yeah, and it'll always be there.
Yeah.
Yeah.
All
Anyway,
right. Well, thank you so
thank
much.
you.
I appreciate your time
Yeah,
today.
thanks for having me on.
Another huge thank you and shout out to Becky Mollenkamp for bravely sharing her story of her loss of her brother. I, once again, will put all of the links for everything she mentioned in the show notes, but you can find her Becky Mollenkamp, and that's camp with a K, .com. beckymollenkamp.com. But please check her out. Check out her podcasts. And yeah, another big thank you, Becky, for being on my show. I appreciate that. If you want to find me, you can find me at nikkithedeathdoula.com. You could also find me on my socials. I'm on Facebook, Instagram, and TikTok, all at Nikki the Death Doula. Thank you so much for tuning in this week. And remember, as always, your grief is yours. Your feelings are valid. Grief doesn't always have to suck. Good Grief with Nikki the Death Doula is produced by Nikki Smith of Nikki the Death Doula LLC in Columbus, Ohio. Nikki the Death Doula LLC is for consulting, education, emotional support, and guidance, and is no way considered a funeral establishment or licensed mental health establishment. Scripts, editing, sound design, literally everything with this podcast is done solely by Nikki Smith of Nikki the Death Doula LLC, with the exception of the music. The music is Cheery Monday by Kevin MacLeod. Licensing information can be found at filmmusic.io.